Everyone thought it was just another envelope. White, thin, official-looking, slipped between the cracks of his wooden front door as if it didn't matter. But when Daniel bent down and picked it up, his hands froze. The return address wasn't from the city, not from the county, not even from his bank. It was from the Homeowners Association. And inside that envelope was a letter that would change everything. He stood there in his hallway, the morning light cutting across the tiles, his coffee still steaming on the counter. His chest tightened as he read the first lines. "This is a formal notice of violation. Immediate compliance required. Penalties may apply." His eyes moved faster, his heartbeat racing. The letter went on, page after page, listing demands that didn't even make sense. He had painted his shutters the wrong shade of brown. His mailbox was non-compliant because it leaned a little to the left. They accused him of storing unapproved items on his porch, when all he had was a rocking chair his late father had given him. And then came the line that made his knees weaken. "Failure to comply will result in legal action, fines, and possible lien against your property." For a moment, Daniel just stood there, staring. A lien? Over shutters, over a chair. The letter trembled in his hand, but what stung more than the words was the feeling underneath them. It wasn't about shutters or paint or a chair. It was about control. Some group of people he barely knew, was telling him that his home wasn't really his. And in that silence, standing barefoot in his kitchen, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years. The mix of fear and defiance. Neighbors always whispered about the HOA, about their letters, their fines, their board meetings that nobody attended because everyone knew who ran them. Karen, that was her name. A woman whose smile never reached her eyes, who lived 2 streets over in a house twice the size of his. She was the president of the HOA, and everyone in the neighborhood knew. When she wanted something, she got it. But Daniel had never thought he'd be her target, not until now. He sank into his father's rocking chair on the porch, the letter crumpled in his fist. The chair creaked under him, steady, grounding, as if his father was still there. He could almost hear the old man's voice, low, calm, the way he used to sound when life felt impossible. "Don't let them scare you, son. A man's home is his dignity." But dignity was exactly what they were trying to strip from him. Why him? Why now? He thought back to last week when he'd refused to sign one of those community improvement petitions Karen was pushing door to door. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now, looking at the sharp, threatening words in the letter, it clicked. This wasn't coincidence. This was retaliation. Daniel's stomach tightened. What should he do? Pay the fines, repaint the shutters, replace his father's chair with something approved, or fight back, risking everything in the process? He closed his eyes, feeling the breeze move across his porch. He didn't know the answer yet, but one thing was certain. He wasn't the only one. Somewhere in the houses lined up on this street, his neighbors had their own envelopes, their own stories, their own bruises from Karen's iron grip. The HOA wanted obedience. They wanted silence. But Daniel wasn't sure he could give them that anymore. Still, he tucked the letter into the inside pocket of his jacket. Not out of compliance, not out of surrender, but because deep down he knew it was only the beginning. And the part no one could predict, what he would discover when he finally stood up to them. Because sometimes it's not the fines or the rules that break a man. It's the hidden truths waiting behind the next letter. The second letter didn't arrive in his mailbox. It arrived taped to his garage door. Daniel woke up to the sound of his neighbor's car idling on the street, headlights catching something pale against his garage. He stepped outside, barefoot again, and there it was, a sheet of paper, bold black letters screaming at him. Final warning. The night air bit at his skin as he pulled it down. His hands shook, not from the cold, but from the audacity. He hadn't even had time to breathe since the first letter, and now this. His eyes scanned the words, each line heavier than the last. Failure to address your violations will result in a lien being filed against your property within 10 business days. 10 days to erase his father's chair, repaint his shutters, and replace his mailbox. Or else. But the strangest thing wasn't the letter, it was the signature at the bottom. Karen's, not board of directors, not HOA, just Karen. Her name bold, confident, as if she alone had the authority to strip him of his home. Daniel's chest burned. This wasn't policy, this was personal. He looked up and saw a shadow in the window across the street. Curtains twitched, a figure moved back. Watching. Someone had been awake to see this note taped to his garage, and Daniel knew in his gut it wasn't just Karen. It was a message to the entire neighborhood. Obey or be destroyed. He sat back on his porch, rocking chair groaning, letter crumpled in his palm. His coffee went cold as dawn crept over the rooftops. He thought about calling the county, calling the police, maybe even a lawyer. But what would he say? The HOA taped a letter to my garage? He could already hear the silence on the other end. Still, something inside him refused to give in. His father's voice echoed louder this time, steady like an anchor. Son, when they push you into a corner, that's when you find out who you really are. But Daniel wasn't the only one pushed into a corner. Later that afternoon, he walked down the block, letter still folded in his pocket. The air felt heavier, neighbors stepping back into their houses as he passed. He reached the end of the street where Mrs. Jensen lived. A widow in her 70s, kind eyes, hands that always smelled of flour from the pies she baked. She was standing on her porch, broom in hand, but when she saw him, her smile faltered. "You got one too, didn't you?" Daniel asked quietly. Her eyes flickered and then she nodded. She motioned him closer as if the walls had ears. 3 fines this month, one for my roses being too tall, one for leaving my trash bin out for an hour, and one for having my grandson's bike on the lawn. Her voice cracked. "I can't afford this, Daniel. I live on a fixed income. They're going to take my home." Daniel's stomach twisted. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it couldn't happen, but the letter in his pocket screamed otherwise. And then she whispered, "Karen came by yesterday. She said, if I support her new project, she might make my fines go away." Daniel froze. What project? Mrs. Jensen's gaze darted to the street, then back to him. Some community expansion. She wants everyone to agree to raise fees, said it would increase property values. But it sounded more like, she trailed off, her face pale. Extortion. That was the word Daniel couldn't ignore. He thanked her, but as he walked back home, the weight of it settled in his chest. This wasn't about paint or mailboxes or roses. It was about power. And Karen was using the HOA as her personal weapon. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, letters spread before him like evidence. His laptop screen glowed faintly, search results scrolling, stories of homeowners across the country, crushed by HOAs, forced to sell their homes, bankrupted by legal fees. But one line stuck out. "You have rights. HOAs cannot operate outside of state law." He leaned back in his chair, the words echoing in his head. Could it be true? Could he fight this? Or was it just another false hope, another trap? The clock ticked past midnight, the house silent except for the groan of the rocking chair when he shifted. He stared at the letters again, at Karen's signature bold at the bottom. His jaw tightened. He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew this. If Karen wanted to scare him into submission, she had underestimated him. Because behind the quiet eyes, behind the calm mornings on his porch, Daniel had something she didn't. He had nothing left to lose. And people with nothing to lose are the hardest ones to control. The first crack in the facade didn't come from a letter. It came from a whisper. 3 days after the final warning, Daniel sat on his porch with a notebook open on his lap. He wasn't writing, he was listening. Every sound in the neighborhood felt amplified, the crunch of tires on gravel, the hollow slam of a trash can lid, the low murmur of voices carried by the wind. Then came the knock, soft, hesitant. He opened the door to find Mark, the quiet neighbor from 2 houses down. A man who rarely spoke above a whisper, whose yard was always trimmed like a photograph, whose eyes now darted nervously over his shoulder. "You need to be careful," Mark said, voice low, almost trembling. Daniel's grip tightened on the doorframe. Careful of what? Mark swallowed hard. His gaze fell to the notebook in Daniel's hands, then back to the street. "She knows you're asking questions. She doesn't like questions." Daniel's stomach turned. Karen. Mark didn't answer, but he didn't need to. He shifted on his feet, pulling something from his jacket pocket, a folded piece of paper, edges frayed as if it had been clenched too tightly. "I shouldn't show you this," he whispered, handing it over. Daniel unfolded the page slowly, his breath caught. It wasn't a violation notice. It wasn't a warning. It was a ledger. Names, dates, amounts, all handwritten. At the top, Community Improvement Fund. Rows upon rows of neighbors' names, each with dollar amounts scrawled beside them. Hundreds, sometimes thousands. And at the bottom, underlined twice, one word, approved. Daniel looked up. What is this? Mark's eyes glistened in the dim porch light. It's her project. She's been collecting money for months. Says it's for improvements, new landscaping, a clubhouse, security cameras, but nothing's been built. Nothing been fixed. Where's the money going? Daniel's chest pounded. And you think? I don't think, Mark interrupted, his voice sharp for the first time. I know she's pocketing it, or worse, and if you push her, if you expose her, she'll come after you harder than you can imagine. Silence hung heavy between them. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked, then fell quiet. Daniel folded the ledger, slipping it into his notebook. His father's voice rose again in his mind. Truth has weight, son. It crushes liars, but it frees the rest. But the truth was dangerous. The next morning, Daniel drove into town, the ledger hidden under the seat of his truck. He pulled up outside the county clerk's office, an unassuming brick building with peeling paint. He sat there for a long time, engine idling, staring at the doors. Could he really do this? Could he walk in and lay the evidence down? Or would they laugh at him, tell him it was an HOA matter, and send him home? He cut the engine, shoved the ledger into his jacket, and stepped inside. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes behind thick glasses, looked up. Can I help you? Daniel hesitated, then set the paper on the counter. I need to know, is this legal? Her brow furrowed as she scanned the ledger. She adjusted her glasses, flipping through the pages. The longer she read, the deeper her frown grew. Finally, she looked up, her voice quiet. This doesn't look like any HOA fund I've seen. Did they file this with the county? Daniel shook his head. No, as far as I know, it's all off the books. Her eyes narrowed. Then it's not legal. HOAs are supposed to disclose everything. Budgets, spending, fees, all of it. If they didn't file, if they're collecting money without documentation. She paused, her voice lowering. It could be fraud. Daniel's breath hitched. Fraud. The word rattled through him, both terrifying and liberating. The clerk leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. But be careful. If she knows you have this, she won't just fine you. She'll ruin you. Daniel left the office with the ledger tucked under his arm, his steps heavier than when he arrived. Fraud. The word echoed louder with every step. When he pulled back into his driveway, the sun was setting, painting the street in hues of gold and shadow. And waiting on his porch, arms crossed, was Karen. Her smile was thin, sharp, deliberate. Evening, Daniel. His chest tightened. She knew, somehow she knew. I couldn't help but notice, she continued, her voice sweet as poison. You've been very curious lately, asking questions, visiting offices, stirring trouble where there is none. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He said nothing. Karen stepped closer, her heels clicking on the pavement. Her eyes locked on his, unblinking. You should remember something, Daniel. This neighborhood, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people who know how to run it. People like me. And if you keep pushing, well, it'd be a shame if you lost the one thing you care about most. Her gaze drifted to the rocking chair on his porch, the chair his father had given him. The message was clear. She turned, her smile never fading, and walked away, her silhouette swallowed by the shadows. Daniel sat frozen in his truck, the ledger heavy in his jacket, his father's chair framed in the dying light. His hands trembled, not with fear this time, but with fury. Because now it wasn't just about him. It was about every neighbor she'd bled dry, every family she'd threatened, every voice she'd silenced. And if she thought he would bow, she had underestimated him once again. Because sometimes, the only way to take back your dignity is to risk everything you have left. It was the silence after Karen's warning that cut the deepest. Daniel sat in his rocking chair that night, the street quiet, his father's voice echoing in memory. A man's dignity isn't in what he owns, it's in what he refuses to surrender. But surrender felt like the easiest option. He could repaint, replace, comply. He could disappear into the crowd of silent neighbors who whispered but never spoke out loud. Yet every time he thought about it, he saw Mrs. Jensen's trembling hands, her roses marked as violations. He saw Mark's haunted eyes, slipping the ledger into his palm as if passing contraband. And most of all, he saw Karen's smile, sharp, knowing, daring him to resist. That smile lit something inside him, not fear, not despair, but resolve. The next morning, he made a decision. He would not fight alone. He started small. A knock on Mark's door, soft but steady. When the door opened, Mark's eyes flickered with hesitation. She already knows you've been digging if she sees you here. Daniel cut him off. Then let her, I'm done being afraid. He pulled the ledger from his jacket. This isn't just about me, or you, this is about all of us, but we can't fight her alone, we need to stand together. Mark's jaw tightened. He looked over his shoulder, then back at Daniel. Finally, with a sharp nod, he whispered, "Come inside." Inside Mark's kitchen, blinds drawn tight, they spread the ledger across the table. The paper seemed to burn between them, every number, every name, every dollar stolen, screaming for justice. "We can't go public yet," Mark said, his voice low. "If she finds out we're organizing, she'll come down harder, but there are others, people she's hurt worse than us." Daniel leaned forward. "Then we find them quietly, one by one." It took days. Careful conversations whispered over fences, hushed exchanges at mailboxes, subtle knocks after dark. Each time Daniel felt the weight of risk. Every shadow could be Karen's eyes. Every curtain twitch could be her watching. But slowly the group grew. Mrs. Jensen joined first, her hands trembling as she pressed Daniel's arm. "I can't lose my home, not like this." Then came Maria, a single mother fined for leaving her car parked half an inch too close to the sidewalk. Her voice shook with anger. "She thinks people like me won't fight back, but she doesn't know what I've survived." One by one they came, a quiet network of the bruised, the fined, the threatened, each with their own envelope, their own story, their own scar. And in Daniel's living room, late at night, they sat together for the first time. 7 neighbors, 7 stories, 7 reasons not to surrender. The room buzzed with quiet fear, but also with something else, something Karen had worked hard to kill: hope. Daniel stood at the front, the ledger in his hand. "She's been using us, not just with fines, with money. She's building something for herself, not for this community. And if we don't stop her, she'll take everything: our homes, our dignity, our future." Silence followed, heavy, electric. Then Mrs. Jensen's voice, soft but clear. "So what do we do?" Daniel looked around the room. Their eyes were tired but steady. He took a breath. "We gather proof, not just this ledger. We get everything, minutes, budgets, bank records. If she's hiding money, there's a trail. And once we have it, we take it higher, the county, the state, anywhere but her board." Mark leaned forward, his voice firm. "That won't be easy. She controls the board, the records, access to everything." Daniel's grip on the ledger tightened. "Then we don't go through the front door, we find another way." For the first time, a flicker of smiles spread through the room. Not joy, not yet, but the quiet relief of realizing they weren't alone anymore. That night, as the group dispersed, Daniel lingered on his porch, staring out at the darkened street. The air was heavy, thick with tension. But for the first time in weeks, he felt lighter, not safe, not secure, but not alone. Then headlights. A black SUV crawled past his house, windows tinted, engine low. It didn't stop, didn't slow, but Daniel felt its presence like a shadow pressing against his chest. Karen. She knew something was shifting. She could feel it. The next morning, Daniel found a new letter in his mailbox. This one wasn't printed. It wasn't official. Just a single sheet of paper, handwritten in bold strokes. "I warned you." No signature, no seal, no rules. But Daniel didn't need them to know who it was from. He stood there in the driveway, the paper trembling in his grip, neighbors' curtains twitching again. Karen wasn't just sending messages now. She was declaring war. And Daniel realized something chilling. This wasn't about fines anymore. This wasn't about money or rules or roses. This was personal. And when battles turn personal, People don't fight fair. The first meeting felt like a secret society. Daniel's living room was dark except for the single lamp casting shadows across the faces gathered there. 7 neighbors, each clutching envelopes and folders like contraband, eyes darting toward the curtained windows as if Karen herself might peer through. The ledger sat in the center of the coffee table, a silent reminder of what they were risking. Daniel's voice was steady, but his hands betrayed the weight of it all. "We need proof, real proof. This," he tapped the ledger, "is enough to raise questions but not enough to take her down. If we go public now, she'll twist it, call it fake, bury us in lawsuits. We need records, bank accounts, minutes from the board meetings, emails if we can get them." Mark leaned forward, his face tense. "She controls the files. They're locked in the HOA office, and only the board has keys." For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then Maria spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "My cousin used to clean that office. She told me once Karen never took the files home, said it was safer to keep them there. If they're still in that office, we can get them." Daniel's chest tightened. "Break in." Maria shook her head. "Not exactly. The office isn't guarded. It's just a small room behind the clubhouse. If we time it right, late enough, quiet enough, we could walk in. No one would know." The room buzzed with murmurs. Fear, excitement, possibility. Mrs. Jensen clasped her hands, trembling. "If she catches us." "She won't," Daniel said firmly, though inside he wasn't so sure. "We'll be careful." The plan was simple, too simple, which made it all the more terrifying. 2 nights later, Daniel found himself crouched behind the hedges near the clubhouse, heart pounding so hard he was sure it echoed. The others waited in the shadows, their faces pale in the dim glow of the streetlight. Mark slipped forward first, a small flashlight in hand. He tried the back door. Locked. He glanced at Daniel, who nodded once. Then Maria stepped up, pulling a thin piece of metal from her sleeve. Daniel's breath caught. "You know how to—" She didn't answer. A faint click broke the silence. The door swung open. They slipped inside. The air was musty, tinged with the faint scent of old carpet and dust. The office was smaller than Daniel imagined. Just 2 filing cabinets, a desk, and a single humming computer. Every creak of the floorboards made his pulse race. He felt the weight of the walls, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Mark moved to the cabinets, rifling through folders. "Minutes, violations, budgets here." He pulled out a stack, flipping quickly. "But look, no signatures, no approvals, just notes scribbled by her." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "She's not filing them officially. She's making it look like the board approved things they never even saw." Maria sat at the computer, fingers flying. "Password protected," her jaw tightened. "Give me a second." Daniel stood by the window, peering through the blinds. Every shadow outside looked like it was moving. Every car that passed made his heart seize. Then Maria gasped, "Got it." The screen filled with files, spreadsheets, emails, budgets. Daniel stepped closer, eyes scanning the numbers, thousands flowing into projects. Landscaping that never happened. Security upgrades no one saw, tens of thousands marked under miscellaneous with no explanation. And then the final blow, transfers, repeated, regular, all to one account. An account not in the HOA's name, not in the board. In Karen's. Daniel's stomach dropped. Fraud wasn't just a suspicion now, it was fact, black and white. Maria's voice trembled. "If we copy this—" "We don't just copy it," Daniel interrupted. His voice was low, hard. "We take it, all of it, every file, every folder. If she catches us, she can destroy one ledger, but she can't erase all of this." Mark shoved papers into a box. Maria loaded files onto a flash drive. Mrs. Jensen kept watch at the door, her hands shaking so badly the knob rattled. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, they had it, evidence, real evidence. They slipped back into the night, the door closing softly behind them. Daniel didn't breathe until they were 3 houses away. Then, for the first time in weeks, his lungs filled fully. They had done it. They had what they needed. But victory was short-lived. The next morning, Daniel woke to chaos. Police cars lined the street. Neighbors stood on lawns, whispering, pointing. And on the steps of the clubhouse, Karen stood tall, her arms crossed, her smile cold. A police officer's voice rang out, "There's been a break-in." Daniel's blood ran cold. Karen's gaze swept the crowd, landing on him. Her smile deepened. No words, no accusations, just the silent promise in her eyes. She knew. And if the stolen files weren't enough to save them, they were about to learn just how far she'd go to bury the truth. Everyone thought the storm had passed. The weekend had been quiet, the kind of quiet where neighbors trimmed hedges and kids rode bikes up and down the cul-de-sac without anyone caring. But inside Daniel's house, silence meant something different. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter, reading the lines again and again. His hands shook even though he tried to grip the paper tighter. The words weren't just rules, they were threats. The HOA wasn't asking anymore. They were demanding. What unsettled him most wasn't the fine itself, it was what came next. The letter spoke of further enforcement actions, words heavy with menace. His mind raced with possibilities. Would they try to put a lien on his house, call the sheriff? Could they even force him to sell? Each possibility felt heavier than the last. He didn't know the law well enough to tell where exaggeration ended and truth began. That uncertainty was worse than anything. He thought about his father's words. "Your home is your dignity. Guard it. Don't let anyone take it away." That line had been drilled into him since childhood, and yet here he was, feeling like someone had already started chipping away at his dignity one demand letter at a time. He folded the paper, but even folded, it felt like it burned in his pocket. At night, sleep refused to come. Every sound outside, car doors slamming, footsteps on the sidewalk, even the rustle of leaves, pulled him to the window, half expecting to see someone watching, taking notes, ready to report him. The HOA had turned his home into a glass cage. That was their power. They didn't need to touch you, they made you believe they could. He started noticing things he'd overlooked before. A black SUV parked too long near the corner. The same neighbor walking past his house twice in the span of 15 minutes. A curtain shifting in the house across the street. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Suspicion crept into the cracks of ordinary life. Trust withered. Even a smile from across the fence felt staged. Yet inside that pressure, something else began to grow, resolve. Daniel wasn't built to fold. He thought of the generations before him, people who had worked fields, built houses with their own hands, fought wars they hadn't chosen. They didn't have HOAs to battle, but they knew something about standing your ground. Maybe this was his war. He sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and began to research. Page after page, late into the night, state laws, HOA bylaws, court cases where homeowners had fought back and won. He highlighted, copied, pasted. His printer hummed until stacks of paper crowded the desk. For the first time, he felt a flicker of control. Knowledge, he realized, was the only weapon that leveled the field. But something about the letter still gnawed at him. A single phrase, hidden in the third paragraph, "Your continued noncompliance will escalate this matter to the highest extent permitted." It wasn't just the threat, it was the handwriting. He had assumed all HOA letters were typed and official. But this one, it had a signature scrawled at the bottom. Not just any signature, Karen's. Karen, the HOA president. The same woman who had once lectured him for leaving his trash bins out for 12 hours too long. The one who had made a scene at the last neighborhood barbecue when his dog barked during her speech. The woman who smiled with her lips but never her eyes. This wasn't a faceless bureaucracy. It was her. And that changed everything. Daniel's chest tightened as he replayed the last HOA meeting in his mind. The way Karen had stared at him longer than necessary, her smile lingering, her tone dripping with false civility. She wanted this. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. And now, with her signature staring back at him from the bottom of the letter, the battle lines were clear. The storm outside began to pick up, rain tapping against the window like impatient fingers. He set the letter down and whispered to himself, "If she wants a fight, she just found one." But deep inside, another thought lingered. If this was Karen's game, what else had she planned? Because the next move wouldn't be his, it would be hers. The morning began with sunlight spilling across the neighborhood, warm and golden, but inside Daniel's chest the heaviness hadn't lifted. He opened the blinds and froze. On his lawn, staked into the grass without his consent, stood a bright red sign. Violation pending enforcement. The HOA had crossed another line. It wasn't just a letter in his mailbox now. It was humiliation planted where every neighbor could see. His fists clenched as he stepped outside, the paper sign flapping slightly in the breeze. A couple walking their dog slowed, glanced at it, then hurried past, whispering. A mother tugged her child's arm, pulling him away before his curious finger could point at the notice. That was the cruelty of it, public shame. Karen knew exactly what she was doing. And yet, as Daniel pulled the sign from the earth, something strange happened. Instead of breaking him, it hardened him. The soil clung stubbornly to the wooden stake, but he wrenched it free and snapped it in two across his knee. His neighbors were watching. He didn't care. Let them see. Let Karen see. Inside, he laid the broken pieces on his kitchen counter like evidence. He pulled out the letter again. He studied every line, every phrase. The threats had teeth, but his research had given him ammunition. He knew the law didn't allow humiliation tactics like that sign. She had overstepped. For the first time, Karen had made a mistake, and Daniel felt it. Still, a part of him whispered doubt. What if the neighbors didn't see it as abuse of power? What if they saw him as the problem? Reputation was as fragile as glass in communities like this. Karen controlled the narrative, the board, even the gossip that swirled at every block party. He wasn't fighting an individual. He was fighting a system, one that thrived on silence. So Daniel made a decision. Silence wouldn't protect him anymore. That evening, as shadows stretched long across the cul-de-sac, he walked to his neighbor Sam's house. Sam had lived there longer than anyone, his porch light always on, his yard meticulously trimmed. When Sam opened the door, his eyes flicked to the broken stake Daniel carried under his arm. Without a word, he stepped aside. Inside, over black coffee, Daniel laid everything out. The letter, the threats, the public shamming. Sam listened, his jaw tightening with each detail. Then he leaned back, sighing. "You're not the first, Daniel. You're just the first who hasn't backed down." Those words hung heavy. Not the first. How many had Karen targeted? How many had quietly paid, complied, or moved away? Daniel felt anger burn, not just for himself, but for every silent victim before him. Sam reached into a drawer and slid something across the table. A manila envelope. "Keep this safe. Minutes from old meetings. Letters they never thought anyone saved. Karen's fingerprints are all over it." Daniel opened it cautiously, scanning the documents. Dates. Names. Fines issued without votes. Rules rewritten without approval. Even whispers of money missing from community funds. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just personal, it was corruption. But as empowering as it felt, it was also terrifying. Knowledge was power, but it was also dangerous. If Karen found out Sam had shared this, she'd make his life miserable too. Daniel closed the envelope gently, promising himself he'd use it wisely. That night, as he walked home under the glow of the streetlights, his mind spun with questions. How deep did this go? How many people were too afraid to speak? And what would Karen do when she realized he wasn't going to fold? He placed the envelope beside his growing stack of evidence. The storm inside him had shifted. No longer fear, no longer uncertainty. It was resolve, sharp and steady. Karen had drawn the battle lines, but Daniel had just discovered she wasn't untouchable. Still, he couldn't shake the unease. Because for every step he took forward, Karen seemed to be 2 steps ahead. And tomorrow, he feared, she would make her boldest move yet. The knock came at dawn. Not the kind of gentle knock a neighbor used when dropping off cookies, but the hard, deliberate pounding of authority. Daniel opened the door, heart racing. 2 men in crisp suits stood on his porch, clipboards in hand. Behind them, a black SUV idled at the curb. "Mr. Daniels," one of them asked. He nodded, bracing himself. "We're here on behalf of the HOA board. You've been issued a final notice. Compliance or escalation, immediate action is required." Their tone was rehearsed, cold, like men reading from a script they delivered a dozen times before. But something about the timing, the staging, it felt like theater. And in the shadows behind the SUV, he saw her. Karen. Arms crossed, lips curled in a smile that wasn't a smile at all. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he reached behind him, grabbed the manila envelope Sam had given him, and held it out. "Before you say another word, read this." The men exchanged a glance. One of them took the envelope, thumbing through the papers inside. Minutes ticked by, the silence louder than the SUV's low rumble. Then their expressions shifted. The script slipped. What they saw in those documents wasn't ordinary. It was damning. Karen stepped forward, her voice sharp. "That's irrelevant. This man is in violation, and the board has the full authority." But Daniel cut her off, his voice steady for the first time. "No, Karen, you don't have authority. You've been making it up. Changing rules, pocketing money, humiliating people who couldn't fight back. You signed those papers. You left a trail." For the first time, Karen's mask cracked. Her eyes flickered, searching for control. But the men weren't looking at Daniel anymore. They were staring at her. One folded the papers back into the envelope, his voice low but firm. "We'll need to take this to the county." Her face drained of color. The SUV door opened and another man stepped out, this one not from the HOA, a county investigator, badge glinting in the morning sun. Daniel hadn't known Sam had gone that far, but the timing was perfect. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Curtains parted, doors opened. They watched as Karen's voice rose, then broke, then fell into silence. For years she had wielded fear like a weapon. Now, under the weight of truth, she looked small. Daniel stood taller, not because he'd won, but because he'd endured. Because he hadn't folded when it would have been easier. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply said the words he'd been holding back for weeks. "This ends here." And just like that, it did. The investigator escorted Karen to the SUV. The men in suits didn't look back. The neighbors whispered, some with shock, some with relief, all with the realization that the queen of their cul-de-sac had fallen. Later, standing alone on his porch, Daniel felt the weight finally lift. The red sign was gone. The demand letters would stop. His home, his dignity was his again. But deeper than relief, there was a lesson. Power wasn't always loud. Sometimes it hid in signatures and bylaws. Sometimes it lived in silence. But it could always be challenged. Always. As the sun rose higher, warming the street, Daniel whispered to himself, "A home isn't just walls and a roof. It's the courage to defend it." And for the first time in weeks, he smiled. Not because the battle was over, but because he knew he'd never let anyone write his story again. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.